Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so excited to have you guys for our last session of the Pergolesi Salon series. I do also want to mention we do have another series coming in March, so keep your eyes out. News on that will be coming soon. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Ryan to introduce our guest conductor and our guest artist this evening.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have three of them with us today, and two who are, as many of you know, artistic associates with Opera Lafayette. Julia Doe, who has been with us for, of course, almost all of these sessions, and who we rely on so crucially. But I don't know that you've had a chance to meet Jonathan Woody, our artistic associate, except in past performances as a performer, and indeed he is the male lead in our Pergolesi program this coming week, and has a long history with us. In fact, it goes back to his graduate school days at the University of Maryland.
Undergraduate.
Oh, undergraduate. When we did Haydn's Il Mondo della Luna in 2003, I think it was, or 4 or something like that.
Something like that.
And has been with us many times since. And we're delighted to have him today. And then I introduce Patrick Dupre Quigley, who is our guest conductor for this performance, and who is the first time that Patrick is with us. And Patrick has a distinguished career as a conductor and as the founder and artistic director of Seraphic Fire, which is a vocal group that does big pieces with vocal ensemble and orchestra in Miami and tours. But I think, Patrick, has that been going 20 plus years now, right?
Yeah, we're 20 and a half years, I think it's right now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yes. So, and we're thrilled to have him here. And they've been in the middle of it this week. That is Patrick and Jonathan, and which is part of the excitement of having them with us today. And Julia, I'm going to turn it over to Julia to ask them a series of questions about both the piece and the process. So Julia, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. I mean, we're really lucky today to be able to have an insider's look, a backstage look at the production process of Opera Lafayette's Serva Padrona, or in translation, Servante Maîtresse. Last week, I talked a little bit about the background of this work, and today we're going to think about the process of bringing it to the stage and questions of adaptation that come up when you're taking something from the 18th century and from a very particular French-Italian context of the 18th century and adapting it for modern audiences in the United States. Before we dive in, I was actually just so curious from Ryan's introductions and was wondering if both of our artists could tell us a little bit more about the process through which they came to be involved in Opera Lafayette and what maybe interested you in this particular project in particular. And I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to talk about maybe a particularly memorable experience you've had in one of your past performances with Opera Lafayette, I'd be kind of curious there as well.
Julia, I'm so sorry. I was actually answering a message as you asked me that question. Would you mind asking once more?
No, certainly. I'm just asking if you guys could both tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved with Opera Lafayette in general terms and your specific interest in this particular production.
Wonderful. Yes. So yes, as Ryan mentioned, I've had a long relationship with Opera Lafayette throughout different stages in my career, starting with my time as an undergraduate student at the University of Maryland. Opera Lafayette was in residence at University of Maryland during that time, and my voice teacher, François Lou, was in a leading role in the production of Il Mondo della Luna, and so he suggested that I serve as one of these very, very tiny bit roles to come on. And that experience, and the experience actually of kind of listening to Opera Lafayette rehearse in the Clarice Center, was actually really formative for me. It created a kind of a love of French Baroque music in general. It's the first time I had really heard it played and heard it live, right, in the concert hall, at my university. And that kind of started me on a track of being interested in early music performances. And I've, as Ryan said, rejoined Opera Lafayette several times. Let's see, in thinking back to a memorable performance with Opera Lafayette, I certainly have to think about the great tree, La Villageoise Éprouvante, which was this wonderful kind of country production of this sort of great story, and it involved a lot of singing and dancing. I was in the chorus for that, and yeah, it was just really wonderful. So that really sunk in for me as an experience putting together these kinds of works. And sorry, then Julia, you had a second part of that question.
No, I mean, I'm certainly fascinated by this much as well. We could also hear from Patrick about his maybe slightly less experience with Opera Lafayette before.
Sure.
I loved that Great Tree production that you mentioned, though, Jonathan. It's such a wonderful, wonderful piece.
So actually, I'll connect the two by saying that particular performance was set in New Orleans, and Patrick Quigley is from New Orleans. So.
Yeah, yes, definitely. And Great Tree has a long history of being performed in New Orleans. First known opera performed in New Orleans was by Great Tree, in fact, which you all just performed, Sylvain recently. I'm a Opera Lafayette neophyte. I happen to know Ryan as a colleague, and we began talking about a possible production during the spring and summer of 2021, when I think we were both still in the process for our respective organizations of producing only online material during that time when we all learned how to be very technically savvy. And I think that we had coffee together and lamented over the state of the art of not being able to actually be in person to perform it. And I was getting ready for my first performance back with my ensemble, in which we were going to be discussing over the course of a 75-minute program the influence of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, which is, and we'll talk about this later, is one of certainly the most influential piece of music written in the 18th century on the 18th century, but one of the very few and possibly the oldest piece of music that was written for, that from the day it was written and day it was premiered has stayed consistently in the repertoire and really has only become more popular over time. And talking about this, Ryan was talking that he was putting together a program and a festival around Louis XV, and both Serva Padrona and the Stabat Mater had their premieres in France during the reign of Louis XV, and went on to have an incredible performance history. And so I think we sort of it came together pretty quickly, and I'm really excited. I'm 4 days in, and it's a wonderful group of artists and crew and staff. So really excited to be doing this.
No, we're so looking forward to how that's going to turn out. So we talked a little bit about Pergolesi's background, the background of these works last week, but I wonder if you could do a little bit of a primer for those who may not have been here, or certainly you have more fun facts than I do. I sort of only vaguely introduced the composer. But for those coming to this performance without having seen a lot of works by Pergolesi necessarily before, what are some of the most important things to know about this composer, interesting things you've unearthed in sort of your research about this composer and his reception history, certainly his posthumous reception history, which is important in our context?
Sure. I mean, the reason that we know Pergolesi is as much because of the lore that surrounds him, that as much as for the excellent music that he wrote. The story of Pergolesi is one of that sort of rocketed him to fame posthumously, was one in which a man of only 26 years old has a terminal illness. He's led a dissolute life in the theater, but comes back to spend his final 6 months writing a sacred piece in a monastery. Some say to repent for his sins. He dies, the piece is premiered afterward is so popular that it instantly eclipses all other settings of the work, really sort of influences all of the bold name composers that come after him, and through this sort of death of a young man who is a genius unrecognized in his own time, we sort of know who Pergolesi is, partially because this story is the proto-Mozartean story. It's the same story that was adopted for Mozart when he died for his Requiem. And that caught on so quickly with Mozart because that story had already been told 50 to 75 years earlier about Pergolesi. In fact, when Pergolesi's music was compiled into a complete works in in the first part of the 20th century, by the time we get to the latter part of the 20th century and those works are analyzed using handwriting analysis, they find that only a third of the music that is composed, that is purported to be composed by Pergolesi, is actually by Pergolesi. In fact, other composers, because it became such a fantastical thing to go on your grand tour from the British Isles during the 18th century and be sold a purported work by Pergolesi, only to find out hundreds of years later that it's by Hasse or by much lesser composers whose works were not terribly valuable. But if they scuffed up the manuscript and put Pergolesi's name on it, people would pay incredible amounts of money to have to own a piece of this legend.
You mean there are people without honor in the music profession? I thought that's
yes,
startling, striking.
Part of the long history of people with no scruples in the musical profession. So, but the piece on which Pergolesi's reputation really rests is that of the Stabat Mater, a piece which is so singular in terms of its treatment of music as sentiment and as the Virgin Mary as being quite human, which was sort of despised by Padre Martini, who was Mozart's one of Mozart's teachers. It was really lifted up by a number of people, Rousseau included, who we think of as being a political philosopher, but was in fact really just wanted to be a composer. He was writing a number of pieces.
Yeah, we talked about that last week. Julia was on the Rousseau, yeah.
And one of his opera was premiered at the same year at the opera that the premiere of Serva Padrona is given. And so this is it's a piece that's the Stabat Mater portrays a sentimental femininity that was really not a part of Roman Catholic sacred music up until that point. The God and the church and the Holy Week were really portrayed as being something grand and far removed from actual people like you and me. And Pergolesi writes this piece that is so ahead of its time, it presages even the operas of Puccini, just in the sentimentality with which it portrays its subject and the speaker who is watching the crucifixion. The harmonic language is incredibly dense and forward-looking. It's hard to think that this work, the Stabat Mater, was composed in 1736, long before some of the great works of the early and later part of the classical tradition, those particularly by C.P. Bach, which have a similar harmonic language, but are written much later than this piece of music. Both the Stabat Mater and La Serva Padrona had a celebrated performance history across the European continent, but in particular in France. The Stabat Mater was premiered probably about 6 or 7 years after its premiere in Naples, and La Serva Padrona received its premiere about it was premiered about 20 years, a little less than 20 years after its initial premiere in Naples, and they were so adopted by the French audience and musical cognoscenti that they became so loved that they were in fact Frenchified in the way that the French have done to their own language, and taking English words and turning them into things like computer, turning it into l'ordinateur. They took both the Stabat Mater and Serva Padrona and made them their own. The Stabat Mater was one of the most frequently performed pieces on the Concert Spirituel. It over time was arranged for larger and larger forces. Its original scoring is for strings and 2 voices. It's the same scoring as Serva Padrona. It was expanded to full SATB chorus and classical orchestra by those who ran the Concert Spirituel. Similarly, Serva Padrona was premiered initially in Italian at the opera by an Italian troupe, but within maybe 3 or 4 years, it had received its own French libretto by Bowrons, and had a number of pieces, accompanied recitatives, which don't exist in Pergolesi's original version.
Sorry, I'm so tempted by all of this material. I have 15 follow-up questions, but I also want to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of the story for our audience. And I was wondering, actually, so we've done this great job of setting up the sort of why Pergolesi was so important, and then also why he was so important sort of in moving to France. And I also really want to think about for our audience, which is something I didn't cover all that well last week, is sort of what is so appealing, and we've sort of covered what's appealing about the Stabat Mater, but before we get back into Servante Maîtresse, maybe we could have Jonathan just even tell us, what happens in this opera? What is appealing about this opera? Who are you playing in this opera? What sort of chain of events should we watch for? And then maybe we can get into some of the musical details.
Sure, yeah. So La Serva Padrona, or La Servante Maîtresse in French, it really revolves around 2 main characters. You've got the male lead, Uberto in Italian, or Pandolf in French, who is the head of a household, a nobleman of some indeterminate status, but he's got this house and he has servants. He has a sort of another servant who we'll talk about in a second, but then he has his female servant, his maid, Serpina, or Zerbine in French. And the story is really a conflict between the 2 of them. So Pandolf is frustrated that Zerbine is not a very good maid. She doesn't listen to his commands. She sort of disobeys him. And then Zerbine, of course, is frustrated because she doesn't want to be a maid. She wants to be the lady of the house. And so she decides to start a scheme that will end up with her getting what she wants. And here's where we introduce our 3rd character, Scapin, who is, as Julia mentioned last week, a mute character in this opera. So we have our wonderful Patrick Quigley, part of the Opera Lafayette family, playing this role. And so he doesn't actually speak or sing, but he does do a lot of acting, and he's actually very, very funny. So if you come to the show, I think you'll laugh quite a bit at his antics. Scapin and Zerbine sort of collude to trick Pandolf, and the trick they come up with is to convince him to marry her, so that she will become the lady of the house. And the way that they do that is by, first of all, sort of, Pandolf decides he needs to marry somebody because he's tired of dealing with this young woman. And maybe a lady of the house will help settle her down. And so when Zerbine realizes this, she thinks very quickly and says, well, what if I trick Pandolf into thinking I'm going to get married as well? So Scapin plays the role of her fictional husband. He comes out on stage dressed as a soldier. And this sort of trick, Pandolf gets, Pandolf, who has felt a sense of fatherly love to his maid Zerbine, despite her, capricious behavior. He's afraid that this soldier will treat her poorly. He'll be a bad husband to her, he'll beat her. And so he has the brilliant idea that he should marry her instead, which is, of course, what Zerbine wanted all along. And so the opera ends with Zerbine and Pandolf deciding that we are going to get married, and then she is the lady of the household. She is the maîtresse, the grande maîtresse, and that's how the opera ends. So everybody's happy.
The servant as mistress. Yeah, we should very much look forward to that happy ending. And as we mentioned last week, we can see a lot of seeds of later 18th century development coming to the fore in this opera. I loved something we were talking about just before we came on. Patrick was saying that, this is, Patrick and Jonathan were saying, the challenges of this opera, if we were just staging it, it would be fine. If we were just singing it, it would be fine. But putting them together is an interesting challenge. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about both of those aspects and also the aspect of putting everything together. So what are sort of the musical highlights and challenges? What are sort of the staging highlights and challenges or concept you're working on? And what has it been like putting these together? And obviously either of you could answer that. Perhaps you could dialogue about those issues.
Sure. I can start if you'd like. Yeah, so let's start with the question about the music. So as Patrick was saying, Pergolesi really has a novel style of composition in this work, and it creates quite a bit of novelty for what the singers are expected to do. So the music is quite virtuosic, but it's not virtuosic in the same way that Handel would be or that Bach would be. It's not a lot of, for example, long melismatic passages or things like that. Instead, there's quite a bit of text. It's almost like a patter, and as Patrick said, this kind of previews what comes later in the 18th century and into the 19th century with opera, and particularly bass roles like myself. This sort of idea of a comic bass who does lots and lots of patter, lots of words that come very quickly. And of course, for me, I would say I'm an intermediate French speaker. And I'm used to singing, when I do sing in French, earlier French Baroque music, which again is much more lyrical. And if there's melisma, then it's generally on one note or one syllable. But of course, for this, it's getting out the very, very rapid fire French words, some of which are very close to each other. So it's making those distinctions between words that sound alike. And then on the other hand, you've got comedy. And as most people who work in theater know, comedy is actually one of the most difficult things to prepare as you work on a piece, because the timing has to be absolutely right. The jokes have to land. One sort of slightly awkward delivery makes the joke not as much fun. And so the challenge really comes in getting both of those things to really execute at the same time at a high level. And maybe, Patrick, you can talk a little bit about how we make that happen.
Sure. I mean, so one of the big challenges of Serva Padrona, certainly when performed in Italian and even more so when performed in French, is that it resembles, more than really anything else that is in sort of the popular zeitgeist at the moment, it resembles a show of Stephen Sondheim. It is nearly all patter. It's short phrases, a lot of text very quickly. Part of the comedy is listening to people speak a number of words that are sort of cleverly rhymed together in various poetic feet, and hearing that come out so very quickly and sporadically. so when we're dealing with musical rehearsal for this, we're actually really just trying to get the musculature of the mouth and the body around this rapid fire music, which also has some strange and interesting harmonic turns. There are some small lyrical moments in La Servante Maîtresse, but the largest of those sort of lyrical and slash coloratura sort of moments actually are pieces that have been inserted into a French version of this show. Pergolesi really thought of this piece as being, I mean, it was written to be in between the acts of a three-act opera seria, so that you would have this incredibly lyrical piece that was very much based on harmonic rhetoric. So the stress and release of complex harmonic systems, that was part of the sort of the vocabulary of the 18th and early 19th century. And then we enter into this world of really just music as speech, music as patter. The Italian version has a spectacularly large amount of unaccompanied recitative, so secco recitative, so just harpsichord, cello, and singer. When we come to the French version, that is removed, and it's created in the style of the opera comique, in that the action is sort of given in rhyming, in this case in rhyming French couplets, which our director Nick Alcott has translated into English rhyming couplets, which it's very fun to hear it performed both in verse in French and in American English, side by side.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure and clarify for the audience how interesting it is that we're dealing with these two levels of translation. So we are performing this originally an Italian opera that the French decided to make French. And so then we had it translated into French. And then for the American audience, we're doing parts of it in English as well. Patrick, do you want to play a little bit of this music, and Jace maybe can help us? So what Patrick has mentioned is that, that there are sort of differences between the Italian and the French versions. Perhaps we could hear a little bit of that music, and then maybe Jonathan could tell us about the process of actually like balancing, the English and the French and the spoken. So sort of we'll hear the first translation from Patrick, and then maybe Jonathan can tell us about this modern translation.
Sure, and so the big difference, the largest differences between the Italian and the French versions happen in the second act. So the first act of this piece, they're very short acts. They were meant as intermezzi. They're just in the middle of something more serious. So they're very short acts. The second act in the Italian version is sort of a cold open. So at the end of the first act, Jonathan, in the form of Pandolf, tells Zerbine or Serpina in the Italian version that, in fact, in order to tame her ways, her sort of sharp-tongued ways, he is going to go out and find a wife who will exert a much greater level of control over Serpina or Zerbine than Pandolf is able to do. So we open the second act with first Serpina sort of lays out a bit of what she's going to do. Sort of like, okay, here's the plan. I'm gonna get him to marry me, and then almost immediately Pandolf arrives and enters into dialogue. And so that sounds, and it's very different both in story and in sound. So that sounds like this. This is the original sort of secco recitative that opens the second act in Italian. Chase. So, and we can stop this now. Pendolf arrives very soon onto the scene of the second act in the Italian version. In the French translation, the French version actually inserts two arias by Zerbine alone, which add an extra level of character that doesn't really exist in the Italian version. The first, which is a slow, almost cavatina-like sort of songish little aria, she introduces herself as an expert and says, all you young women out there who are looking to catch old rich men, sit back and watch, because I'm going to teach you something right now. I'm going to show you how it's done. And that is followed by almost a cabaletta, where the intention of Zerbine changes almost night and day, and she sings an aria called Charmant Espoir, which is charming hope, in which basically she says, I've been waiting, instead of being this sort of wry, knowing servant who is going to reel herself in a really big fish. She says, I have been waiting for this my entire life, and it has been torturing me. So hope, please allow this to finally come to reality. And this is an aria which, in the context of this piece, sounds much later. I mean, so this is probably written about 20 years after the premiere of Serva Padrona. It's in French. You can already see the style of music changing toward the more sentimental style that is typified by C.P.E. Bach, and so it's a piece that really sounds more like the type of coloratura that you would find in Exultate Jubilate by Mozart than you would perhaps in any work by Pergolesi. And so this is the beginning of Charmant Espoir.
Is this what doing your laundry looks like? When you love it,
YouTube.
instead.
That's funny. That
It's
doesn't,
not been
doesn't sound
recorded,
like
so we have to go
Charmant
through the commercial. Here we go.
All right. So for those of you who are listening who speak French, of course, probably realize that this is strangely a reverse version of this. This is from an Italian production of La Servante Maîtresse, as sung by an Italian soprano. So you'll forgive some of the mispronunciations there. But a very interesting early, I think it's 2010 performance of the French version of this work at an Italian festival dedicated to the music of Pergolesi.
Now, which, of course, there are no recordings of the French version, so we had to find the live thing on the YouTube there.
Yeah,
Yes,
it really underscores how sort of special this event will be, that it's very, very rare to get this French version, though actually the French version was way more popular in France and actually served as the basis for translations that were made elsewhere. So it's like a game of telephone with this opera. Jonathan, do you want to weigh in here a little bit about this question of the production itself? So this question of the second translation. I mean, so what is it like for you as a singer balancing sort of the new English dialogue with the French? And also maybe you could tell us just like about the concept of the staging. How is Nick, the director, approaching this opera?
Sure. Yeah. So for me as a singer, one of the things that I really work on is language, and understanding really deeply what it is I'm singing, and then being able to convey that clearly. So one of the things I did to try to prepare for this role was I actually wanted to see what the original Italian language, sort of how the libretto was set originally in Italian. And I found this interesting document online that showed a translation of the original Italian into French, not a lyric French that has the rhyming verses, but a direct translation. And so I found it really interesting to compare the French translation of the Italian and then the lyric translation that eventually became adapted for the use for Servante Maîtresse. And they've just made a few little changes, some of which are, perhaps more culturally relevant. And I think that also took place as Nick worked to create this English translation of the French dialogue. One of the things I really think is cool in translation is how you have to not just translate the language, but also you have to get the culture. The jokes have to be jokes that we as Americans will understand, not necessarily jokes that French people think are funny or that Italian people think are funny. And so I think, to answer the second part of your question, Nick has done a really, really great job of that. And I think principally what he is doing in the production, he's making use of actually quite a limited set of things like staging and set. The set will basically just be these three chairs. There's 6 chairs, each set up in pairs of 2. Sorry, probably could have put that in a more succinct way. And as the action unfolds, the chairs themselves sort of move around the stage. We move them, and we use them to kind of convey some of these different dynamics between the characters. So, for example, there's an aria where Zerbine is trying to convince Pandolf that he should marry her, and he says, "No, you're my servant. I couldn't possibly do that." And so Zerbine kind of chases Pandolf around the stage, and oftentimes the chairs themselves become these little barriers where Pandolf will hide behind a chair and say, no, you're not going to get me. And then Zerbine will come around it and say, hey, here I am. So it's that kind of thing. There's quite a bit of use of physical comedy and of sort of the graying of the line between the social class of these characters. Pandolf as a sort of more noble gentleman, and Zerbine as a sort of more of a servant class, and yet there are moments where those barriers break down, where perhaps she flirts with him in a way that's a little too familiar or something like that. And I think that really heightens the comedy that's in the work, that's built into the work. Yeah. Does that help answer that question?
We heard some Italian recording and a little bit of French recording. I'm wondering whether you could choose a verse of Nick's in English and just give people a sense of how it works. And if you want to take a second to do that while Julie asks another question, you could.
Sure. I was going to say you're going to put my memorization on the spot.
I know. If you've all booked yet after 3 days of rehearsal.
Well, and I'm going to have to be because I'm talking to you on my iPad, which is where my score lives. But sure, why don't, if Julia, you want to maybe touch on another point and I can prepare something?
Sure. So I was actually going to say, I was hoping, well, and actually we can have Patrick answer this question first. I want to be sure that we have lots of time for audience questions. So my sort of last sort of question for our 2 speakers, and actually is relevant for both of you and really builds off of Jonathan's last point, is this question of adaptation and how does this speak to a 21st century audience. So this was an opera that was very, very progressive at the time, certainly in terms of class relations, maybe for the time in terms of gender relations. Not all of it, of course, translates to the 21st century. So my question is, how are you as a production dealing with that? What do we have to be careful with Pergolesi, but also what is really still relevant for a contemporary audience? Certainly it's very, very funny, but there's also a depth there maybe that comes out. Yeah, and perhaps we can have both of your opinions on that, though also I know Jonathan is distracted with the other thing we've made him do.
Sure. I mean, some of the we have had to make some decisions about the translations into English that we use for the super titles, because there are, quite frankly, some ways of that Pandolf talks about that talks about Zerbina and their relationship, which in a 2023 society, in a free 2023 society, actually are sort of uncomfortable at best. There's a moment where Pandolf is talking about how he came to employ Zerbina, and the translation that we use is like, I met her family, I hired her from her family when she was young, and she came to work for me, which is already a little, I mean, there's child labor going on from the very beginning of this, because she is a sort of a young budding woman when we encounter her, but she's been in Pandolf's employ for 10 years at this point. And the true sort of French translation of this is, I went and found this great family. I bought her from, I asked her parents to give her to me, and they gave her to me, which is clearly something that was probably a little bit more coercive than that sort of thing. Additionally, this is a relationship that he is clearly thinks of himself as her father for 3/4 of the show. He talks to her as if like she is a petulant child that he has raised so well and given all these, given you food and shelter and a job, and now, well, what about, you're thinking about marrying this very brutal man, but you know what? Maybe you should just marry me instead, and you can be my wife, which is, one of these. And she says, like, how I am, because this is in one of the duets. She says, how I am because, you've had me for 10 years. And so, like, there's some, like, coercive underage issues. There is whether or not she has entered his service voluntarily, or if she's basically been bought from her parents, who needed the money and gave her over as a child. Probably, I mean, we think that she was probably 8 or 9, somewhere between 8 and 11 when she came to work for Pandolf, based on the text. And that's assuming that she's 21 when she's making this decision to marry Pandolf, but probably, she's more like 18 or 17, just from the age of when someone would have been at their sort of blooming prime in the 18th century. And so it makes for some uncomfortable things for us. And so we have, in order to perhaps update the sentiment, we've taken some of that uncomfortable nature out of the translation that shows in the super titles.
I think it might be worth mentioning that we asked our Zerbine, Hannah DePriest, who I think some of you met on a previous when she was a guest when she was on earlier a couple of weeks ago, but she couldn't be here tonight. But we did ask her about this question, and it might be interesting to hear how does she take on it. And then she wrote an answer for a Weta blog question, and she says, "Here's my 2 cents on Zerbine. The character." Runs circles around her male stage companions, figuratively and literally. She's ambitious, cheekily optimistic, and fiendishly manipulative. The opera's entire plot is devised by Zerbine. The show the audience is watching is the acting out of her absurdist plan to marry her master. Yes, women of the 18th century were broadly locked into rigid social structure that limited their opportunities, but the very existence of a show like La Servante Maîtresse proves that cannot be the whole story. Imagine. So she goes on, but it's, I think, of course, the interesting question here is like, how does she take on this role, and how does she deal with it? In addition to how you all deal with it. And I thought it was fun to read what she had said earlier today.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate sort of the thoughtfulness that's going into the production in that regard. I mean, it's certainly something that we talk about in all sorts of 18th century operas, Mozart certainly as well. Jonathan, did you find a passage to quote for us? And then I want to certainly open it up to questions from the audience as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll talk about this passage since we're discussing this topic right as we speak. So this is a moment where I had sent out Scapin to fetch my walking cane so that I could go out for some air, but now I've had a change of heart, and so this is what I say to him: Scapin, not I, but you go out. I'll tame this shrew, have no doubt. One thing only can end this strife. Go at once, find me a wife. Zerbine says, a wife? I say, a wife indeed, this very day I'll marry. To the marriage broker man, don't tarry. A wife, be she ugly, be she old. Scapin, be off, do as you're told. Zerbine says, Monsieur finds he needs a wife. I say, I do indeed, upon my life. It's the only thing to do. Only a woman could handle you. In this, I could not be more vehement. Zerbine, and I'm in complete agreement. Pandolf, I'm astounded. You agree, Zerbine, because the one you'll wed is me. Pandolf, you, what do you take me for? Zerbine, the man I worship and adore. I shall have no other man but thee, and thou shalt wed no one but me.
It's going to be very clever.
Yeah. So here we are taking it from Italy to Paris to Washington and New York.
A real-time traveling show, that's for sure. We have some questions in the chat already, and actually this plays very well into the structure of the program as a whole. So as we mentioned, there is both this opera and this Stabat Mater on the program, and this question in the chat is thinking about the incongruity between music and text in the Stabat Mater, and perhaps, Patrick, if you could elaborate a little bit on how this piece was received, and maybe also thinking about the relationship between the two halves of this program, besides, of course, the historical, so interesting in the very popularity and proximity of composition of the works.
So the Stabat Mater resembles in almost every way the language of an opera seria of the time, rather than what church music would have sounded like. In fact, it starts an issue in church music that becomes such an issue in church music, particularly in France, but also in Italy, that Pius one of the Piuses has to issue a white paper basically forbidding the use of opera arias with sacred words in the course of the liturgy. It was thought of as highly sentimental, highly feminine, which in the patriarchal church of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, I mean, through the 21st century, I'm an Irish Catholic, I could say this, but it really challenged the masculinity of the church, and particularly the masculinity of the crucifixion story. And so, beginning with the Stabat Mater, we begin to get more and more sentimental style church music that becomes such an issue in the 19th century that we have someone like Gounod, who really started out as a church music composer, who then starts writing operas because he's so versed in the idea of this sort of romantic sentimentalism that begins really with the bringing of the Stabat Mater into the Holy Week services of Naples, and the confraternity that commissions it. It has been a long day of rehearsal.
Well, it really reminds me actually of a quote from a letter written to Rousseau, which is about the spiritual concerts in Paris. And he writes, by the middle of the 1750s, I know of no one who has found religion at the concert spirituel, and many people who have fallen in love with Italian arias. I'm paraphrasing, but this idea that operatic music really infused church music at this point. So it'll be a very interesting parallel to see. Any other questions for our audience, for our performers? Or from Ryan, certainly, if anything came up for you as well.
Oh, Susan's
Can I
got
ask
one.
a question? I'm curious when I hear this, a lot of the kind of tropes of the young girl and the older man the older man is often just a buffoon. I mean, he's really a fool. But Jonathan, the way you're describing the character that you play doesn't really sound like that. He sounds more modulated. Do you have a view about that? About how you see him?
Well, it's interesting. I enjoy playing these sorts of characters as a base. This is often the type of character I play. I often play a much older character than I am as a man. And I think one of the things that I like to do is concentrate on the nobility. It's one of the things I think is the most interesting about the 18th century. These social roles and hierarchies, and we still have them in the 21st century, but they're very different. They look very different. So I like to play that up. Now, sometimes that means I get a note that says you're acting a little too you're acting a little too sophisticated. Try to make it funnier. Try to make it goofier. Try to low. So I think it is it's one of these things where it's a matter of taste with the director and with the artists. And we try to find a balance that works. Because I agree with you, Susan. I mean, I think that many of these characters, they don't necessarily have a lot of depth. They're just kind of older guys who, want a younger wife. And I guess I try to bring as much depth as I can. But of course, at the end of the day, it's about having a good time. So.
Always so interesting how you read these pieces and they don't always make the same impression on the page as on the stage. I was curious if sort of anything has really struck you or what you have sort of learned in the process of, these past 3 days, actually sort of bringing to life this thing that you've just been studying on your own. There's sort of the main differences between page and stage in this case.
I mean, for one, I think the demands of the vocal music, I guess from my perspective, I do a lot of concert work. And so I think a lot about things like ornamentation. I think a lot about things like lyricism and like having a beautiful tone. And that's not as necessary here. It's much more important really that I convey the character than that you're getting sort of this very, very refined singing. And of course, I'm going to try and sing as beautifully as I can so that you all enjoy it. But that has been a change in my thinking in this process, like focusing more on what makes the character funny necessarily than sort of singing at my sort of highest level in terms of beauty and those colors. And Patrick and I have been working to find the right balance for that. And in fact, he's almost as though he's given me permission to have a little bit more fun with the character. And so you'll hear some lines where instead of singing the exact notes on the page, I'm almost giving you a shout or a vocalism that's much more about conveying a character than it is about sort of the Stabat Mater, of course, written for a soprano and a mezzo soprano or a contralto or a countertenor. So I don't usually sing that, but if I were to sing it, that would be the approach that I would take. It would be much more sacred. And of course, in this production, really, I don't need to do anything like that. And so that's a bit of an adjustment for me, just as a singer, based on what I often do elsewhere.
Oh,
it's funny when we had a master class with a famous bass baritone within the last year, and he was trying to get the singers to think more about the speech and to make sounds that were not always beautiful. And he says the one that's not beautiful is the one that they'll remember, but he meant for good reasons, not just for bad reasons. And so it's a program with two very different style, as Patrick said in an answer to another Weta question. Completely different styles, and as I think you're pointing out, Jonathan, not just styles of comedy versus religious music, but a different way of approach to vocalism too.
Yeah, a couple more questions we have in the chat. Someone sort of asking about the afterlife of this opera in other plots. So certainly it's something like Elixir of Love, or if there are other sort of plots in which you see this resonate besides the direct translations. Jace also wants to know sort of how you're preparing for this in last sort of run of preparing. So do you have any sort of rituals in this final run up to the show next week?
I would. Oh, sorry. Please, Patrick, go ahead.
No, I mean,
answer that.
I think we would be hard pressed to underestimate. I mean, I think almost certainly we will underestimate the influence of Serva Padrona and the Stabat Mater on music of the late 18th and early 19th century. Both of these pieces existed in so many different editions at a time when the printed page was much more rare than it is now. Like the Stabat Mater, for example, existed in more than 40 editions, differently printed by different publishers. The composers who knew the work, both the comedy and the tragedy of Pergolesi, and who stole from it, and very sort of baldly, like Gluck uses both of these pieces in his operas. Mozart quotes both of these, both in terms of how the characters sort of interact with each other, the maid character, the older buffoon character, but similarly, like some of his writing in even in the first movement of the Requiem is taken directly from the Stabat Mater. Haydn, his version of Stabat Mater was premiered as the second half of a concert spirituel program, where the first half was the Pergolesi Stabat Mater. Each one of those, like literally everyone knew of these two pieces who was in music and probably had been a part of a production, had seen it, had studied it, had copied it. They were the highest ranking of pieces. Pergolesi often is found in in paintings on walls where today we're like, Pergolesi, right? We can't know just how much influence he did have. And so I think that every comic Italian opera of the 19th century owes its roots to Serva Padrona, quite frankly. And quite frankly, quite a lot of serious French opera owes its affect to the music in the Stabat Mater.
Yeah, it'll be really, really exciting to hear that put to life. Yeah, sorry, I just interrupted someone. Or was it, did I interrupt myself with an echo? Well, maybe we could hear our final. So what are the sort of the last rituals you have as you're preparing for the performances next week? Or what are you most looking forward about this event as we sort of wrap up for a final question?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I'm like a person who has a lot of rituals for performance, but I will say that one moment for me that really changes it from rehearsal to performance is when we arrive in costume. Costume for me is kind of the moment that changes everything. And I had a moment to fit my costume this week. It's only been a couple of days, hasn't it? And
it just seems like that months, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the instant that I had it on, it changed everything about sort of my approach to the character. I mean, my posture changed. Like, there's something about seeing myself in the mirror in the garb that really makes it real for me. And so I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to when we start to do runs with costume. I think it'll really put me in the headspace of this world and this time and this place that's so different from our own. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Oh, of course. No, it's what we're all looking forward to being transported back into that world with you. Yeah. Well, it's 7:00, and so I don't want to keep anybody, but we'll stay on for another couple of minutes if anyone wants to ask any additional wrap-up questions, or if Ryan, if you wanted to say anything to wrap things up. Or Ryan.
Any questions? Any questions? No, I'm really looking forward to seeing this. I haven't yet been in the rehearsal room, so it's great to hear about it.
It's going to be wonderful.
And I don't know if the audience knows that this is technically speaking, it's a semi-stage production insofar as the orchestra is on stage, and behind the actor singers, and that poses kind of special challenges to a conductor, Patrick, and because you have to either keep your head over your shoulder, or just they have to feel your emotions from the side, out of the side of their eyes, instead of being able to just kind of look at the audience and see you in the peripheral vision underneath them, as they would if the orchestra was in the pit. And
yes,
we've done some major productions that way before, so I'm well aware of it. But I wonder how you feel about it.
Well, I mean, it definitely it in some ways makes parts of this less spontaneous, but also so that we are committing to a particular performance. Fortunately, Nick is doing a really good job of integrating sort of character action that figures out how to at least have the conductor in peripheral vision at moments where the music stops and then immediately starts again, or where the music changes tempo drastically. The real interesting part about this, and this sort of goes with the previous question, which is that we don't actually know what this show is, and in particular, because this is a one night only performance, we don't really know what this show is going to be until we get on the stage and are in front of people and can't stop for any reason. The thing about like dress rehearsals is that, yes, we're really supposed to go all the way through that, but if something goes terribly wrong, we sort of stop and deal with stuff. I'm coming off of a one night only performance of a very different sort. I was with the New World Symphony in Miami, conducting Orff's Carmina Burana, which is so many people, and it was another one night only production. And one of the most fun things about these is that it's like getting on a roller coaster that you will only go on once, and that you're the first person to ride it. And so you get on this roller coaster and you pull out of the dock, and anything could happen. Literally anything could happen, and you have to roll with it, which is what makes the excitement. You get one shot at it, which to me is not scary, but rather sort of the exciting fun. We set up basically as much architecture as we can in rehearsal to say, like, these are where the stairs are, this is where the doorway is. But we do all sort of the decorating during the actual performance. The walls are drywalled during the performance. And so you are not watching, those of you who will be in the audience are really watching, it's something that you can't get from watching a television or watching a movie of a production or a recording, which is that you're watching people make music in the moment, which is a thrilling and magical thing that only happens live. And you can only really feel it live, where someone takes a part of an animal that's strung across a part of a piece of wood, and by pulling it across each other, it makes your eardrum vibrate 100 feet away in the audience. And that's alchemy. That's what you're experiencing, and that's why live performance is so fantastical, because we can't like cut and put something else in. So it's the most fun thing that we do. I think
it reminds me. I thought I could add one thing to that about on the dialogue front. Is we had a big debate internally, Nick and me and Lisa. We talked a lot about whether or not we would do surtitles for the English dialogue in addition to with the French. And of course, we're doing surtitles for the French for everybody, so they understand see everything in English. But we decided, and Nick and his experience has played into this a lot, not to do titles while they are doing the dialogue of the comedy, because we know what it's like for someone to hear a laugh from the audience before they've delivered the punchline, and it could throw the performers off. And so that will make it even more spontaneous in the way that Patrick has talked about. So we hope you all enjoy that.
going to be a great show, and we're so looking forward to it. And I don't know if everyone could sort of thank me and join me in thanking our panelists. It was so lovely to hear these insights for you that'll really help prepare taking in this performance and getting the most out of it.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Virtual applause. Yeah. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.
Okay.